6th of November 2024 of the Climate Action Committee. Lovely to have everybody here. Welcome to those online. I see online there, Clyde, thank you, and those in the room. We might start with Karakiā, if I just might take us through that. Thank you. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mākina kina ki uta, kia mātaratara ki tai. Ihi ake ana te atakura, he tiu, he huka, he hauhu, tihei, mauri ora. Right, and then we will go to the health and safety statement, which looking around, most people are quite familiar with. So if anybody is not, please have a read of that on page 6. And we'll go straight into the apologies. We have an apology from Councillor Chair Story, who is away on council business at the combined sector meeting, and Councillor Clarkson for absence as well. But we do have the other members of the committee here, other than Tipa Mahuta, but I haven't heard from her. So we'll just, I'm happy to move the apologies as they are on the screen. Second from Councillor Kneebone. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. Right, then we'll move on to confirmation of the agenda. Anybody have anything they'd like to mention? The agenda, I think we're good. There are, Ben, were you happy to move agenda? And Mike? Yep. Thank you. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Awesome. Then we will jump to disclosures of interest. I've heard of one disclosure of interest in regarding, actually, Stu, I'll let you talk to it.
Yeah, so just disclosing that Taranaki Offshore Partnership are submitters on the coastal plan, and I'm a hearing panel member on the coastal plan, so I will leave the room while that presentation has been made.
Thank you, Stu. That really appreciate you keeping that process safe. And we have worked through that. So I'm happy to move that. Ben, you happy to second? All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Great. Then I might just hand over to Karen for a minute to help just open up anything else you want to say about the meeting.
Thank you, Chair. Atamarie councillors. Today on our agenda we have 7 items, and just quickly to run through what we've got there and how they respond to our council strategic direction and the adaptation and mitigation aspect. So item 6.4, the update on the risk assessment. As you know, the risk assessment sits within our sustainable development priority and is all about working toward resilient communities that plan for intergenerational well-being and develop with nature in mind and are able to respond to and recover from adversity. This item is a very important part of our adaptation work, and we're here to report on the progress that's been made to date, and also to update you on some recommended changes so that we could provide a more cost-effective climate change risk assessment to our communities to enable that adaptation planning. So we're looking forward to that discussion with you. Item 6.5, the Waikato Regional Council Emissions Reduction Plan and certification, our 8th successful audit. And then 6.7, the work we're doing on renewable energy and the presentation we're receiving. These are the mitigation aspects of our work program, or report or respond to those. And that covers off 2 of our goals in the transition to the low emissions economy priority in our strategic direction. So almost half of that priority covered in discussion today. And then item 6.6 is both responding to the need to adapt and to mitigate. And that's the Te Aki Turoa Nature Plus response, where we are looking to enhance biodiversity, water quality, and our climate change response through Indigenous planting. Welcome, Councillor. So on that note, we'll get underway, and I think it's back to you, Chair, with your report.
That is, thanks for that, Karen. So 6.1, the first item there is the Chair's report. Just started adding these to see how other councillors like having them. Also, I've been out and about on my own, travelling to the councils across the districts in our region and presenting our climate action roadmap. I've said in here I'll take it as read, but I am really keen to get a little bit of feedback now. And welcome Councillor Cookson coming in as well. I did have the constituent councillors invited to all of those, and it was really cool to have particularly Stu Nebone and Ben and Robbie. I did have you come along to those. My reflections are in the report there. Key point for me has been we are so diverse as a region, therefore would love to have our council partners there think of us as providing amazing customer service to help enable them deliver the best climate action for their communities that they can. And so that's something that I'm going to be doing over the next little while, is just keeping in touch with those districts, whether it's key staff, whether it's councillors, and keep asking them how we are meeting their needs. There are some bits of duplication here and there, or there will be in future perhaps. So really cool to hear about how the cross-council staff group is working towards that. Not quite sure how the collaborative piece is going to work going forward with the elected members because we're so diverse, but figuring that out over time and noting there's a really big interest in adaptation projects. So while this council has been part of some of those that have happened around the place so far, I think there's a bit we can share learnings around the place and give some of them a bit of a nudge as to what they might like to consider with their communities. So just want to invite anyone who's been part of that to comment, say anything, and give any feedback on what I've been getting up to, basically. Go for it, Councillor Dunbar-Smith.
Thank you. Two questions. One, you're talking in here, item number 2, about shifting away from carbon and emissions towards a more holistic roadmap, ecosystem and earth science help. Can you explain what you mean by that, and what will it mean for this committee or for them?
Yeah, sure. No, thanks for bringing it up, because it was one point I didn't really touch on when I just did that summary. So part of it is more, it's already in our climate action roadmap anyway. So the planetary boundaries are explained at the front as a scientific concept, I suppose. But it was when councillors in the districts brought up the fact that they want to connect with their communities on these things, but sometimes the words and the terminology of carbon and emissions tends to trigger people or make people feel like they don't know much about this topic, whereas they know lots of things and care very deeply about those other things I've mentioned, whether it's waste or pollution or that type of thing. So I think there's just an opportunity there to keep leaning into that reframing, mainly because we are doing a lot of those things. There are sections of, say, the planetary boundaries that we're not heavily invested in at the moment. That would be things like what they call novel entities, which is pollution of, say, microplastics or endocrine disruptors and things. It's something that I've brought up in other areas around the state of the environment reporting. It'd be good to have more of that. But all in all, it's just how to connect with people more by using the right framing. Whereas you see in even one of these other items in here around the Toitu report, it's pretty technical and hard for someone from the public to connect with. Yeah, so what it means though for here, I think the opportunity next triennium is for the council to consider whether it has a climate action committee or whether it's something that we keep integrating into everything that we do further. I think the opportunity is there for that. Yeah, depending on who's around the table and what they want to do.
Secondly was in terms of the adaptation stuff, which currently comes to the Strategy and Policy Committee. You mention in there that Climate Change Committee links with that, but are you proposing a greater integration, or what's your thought on that?
I think I'm putting a bit of thought into that at the moment. We've always said we wanted to help, and that links to the local climate risk assessment, which is later in the papers as well, that we want to know and dedicate our resources based on risk of what's kind of hitting where. But at the same time, there's also which communities are ready to have the conversation before others, or which council is ready to lead that conversation. what I'm kind of mentioning there is it touches on both committees as it's slowly migrated from last triennium starting off in this committee. It's integrated into strategy and policy. And so it's kind of between the two, but it would be really, really useful and great for our communities to have a consistent quality of communication with their council on how we do adaptation projects. And currently, because they are quite siloed, I think there's something we need to figure out. Whether we figure it out through Stratton Poll or through this committee doesn't really matter. But and I don't know what it's going to be, but I welcome the thoughts on it.
That's
from
relevant to
everyone.
the next item about the Auditor General's report, isn't
It is.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, I actually noticed that the next item has a lot of similar reflections as the ones that I've kept up. So I think there's an opportunity there actually to have a think about whether we, say if I did go back to the districts, because a lot of them did invite me to come back, give them a short summary of the Auditor General's recommendations, because they might not have had it on any of their agendas or read it, just to show that this is kind of more evidence for why we want to do what we want to do with them. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other feedback yourself, Stu, maybe from having come along to Waitomo and Otorohanga and Waipa? Excuse me, Mike.
I thought it was all pretty well received. So.
Yeah, no, I think they appreciated seeing us in person, eh?
Yep.
And Robbie?
Yep.
You like getting around the place?
Actually, Mike and myself and Warren were at the Thames Coromandel adaptation meeting the other day, and
Yes.
the CEO pulled me aside and actually said that she was thanking councillors and our staff for how well they're working together at the moment. So that was a real bonus. She said of all the councils, because she's worked in Plenty Regional Council as working with consents and stuff, and she's also been the CEO of Apotiki. And she said our relationship with Thames Coromandel was very productive. So she thanked everybody so she asked me to say that. So yeah, thank you.
Awesome. That was a really good session, and I thought it was really interesting. You go, Robbie.
Well, one thing though is I think we've got to be careful with the adaptation stuff, that we keep the wording of climate change to a minimum, because the government that we're asking for funding has got the narrative that wording shouldn't be in there. And I just, especially with Thames is wanting $24 million to do their foreshore protection, it's really important that we have the right wording in there, that we are to get the funding from central government. We just got to be very careful how we word things from now on, because we don't want that stopping.
Yeah, it's quite common.
The investment happening is all I'm trying to point out. Thank you.
For those who are well versed in grant writing, they know to write it to the audience. So, yeah, and I thought it was interesting that TCDC were at the point where they've come so far in their journey that they're saying, we want to work with you both at elected member and staff level to figure out the nitty gritty of the next hard steps where things are pretty uncertain and we don't have enough guidance, but they're quite far ahead in that journey, whereas there are other districts where, they haven't even thought about.
That's a huge investment, because in the end, they're wanting us to take the lead. They're wanting that to come under the Waihaupiyako River Scheme.
Yeah.
So that is a big number for even us to start thinking about taking. So it's a whole big discussion.
Definitely. So is there anything else on the Chair's report? Quite happy with the direction it's going at the moment? Mike?
Yeah, I was at Rotorua District Council on Tuesday. So yeah, that like Tim's wrap with the communication that's coming from, and they mentioned you as well coming down. So just with the councillors and also the staff, informing them in all aspects, the stuff that's happening with WRC. So
That's awesome. No, and Pamela as well mentioned that she'd had lots of positive feedback. So I think we should keep getting out there just in whatever capacity we're interested in. Right. Then if Mike could move that, and Ben, you happy to second? Thanks. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Didn't want to move my own report. All right. Then we'll move on to the Office of the Auditor General report, which has 5 recommendations. Who's presenting this one? Sorry, Karen?
I am.
You are? Thank you.
Chair.
Need to check my run sheet.
Yeah. So yes, councillors, you have already referred to this next report from the Office of the Auditor General on how well 4 councils are responding to a changing climate. The genesis of this report was the OAG's interest in how councils are mitigating GHG emissions, but also how they are preparing their communities and adapting to the changes we're already feeling and what we will experience into the future. As Councillor Nicol noted, the OAG has made 5 recommendations, which the office thinks are applicable to all councils in New Zealand. And certainly as I read the recommendations, I thought there was some great opportunity for us to incorporate some of those recommendations into our own work programs. As you noted, we should take every opportunity we can to collaborate more closely with our other council colleagues and assist each other to do well. So it's great to see that's underway. But yes, we can always look to do more where we can. For a staff view, I would really like to focus on strengthening the performance measures and the way we report to you. So really looking to you for feedback and direction on what you need to be able to make good governance decisions. And the reason for putting this on first was so that you could reflect as we go through today's meeting to think about what we might do better, what changes we might incorporate. And then with your feedback and with some ongoing discussions we're having with stakeholders, the next meeting of this committee, we can actually bring back a plan that shows how we propose to incorporate these recommendations into our work programs. And we'd appreciate feedback on that. So I will take the report itself and the OAG report as read, and happy to take any questions.
Councillor Dunbar-Smith.
Yeah, I wonder if Councillor Nicol had been speaking to the Office of the Auditor General prior to doing the tour. Certainly collaboration is there. I note that I think the performance measures we've got are pretty strong. I wondered whether it's worthwhile voluntarily submitting to the Office of the Auditor General to see.
They're interested to give feedback.
Well, there might be if they've done the report.
I had the same thought actually, but I don't know if that's the done thing.
Well, it gives them a
yeah.
benchmarking. I mean, there's no reason why not. It probably wouldn't take them long to look through what we're doing, but I imagine we're way ahead in terms of performance measures and everything else.
In many ways, yeah.
We have had a number of audits of our climate change response, but I do think that would be interesting for someone who has recently looked very specifically at these issues with respect to councils to see if they do have an interest in looking at ours as well. Yeah,
and also that item number 4 about climate-related activities, how they're being governed. It comes back to your strategy and policy question earlier.
Yes,
about,
it does.
Yeah, so.
And that's if we did get to a point where all of the districts are having conversations of some scale in their district, how would they want to govern that to be consistent everywhere? Or maybe, I have no idea at the moment, but it'd be a conversation for that might need to be prepped late this training so that it gets off the right foot next training. Agree with you.
Thank you.
Something I picked up in here was just the piece around engaging communities, and particularly called out Te Ao Māori and the wider framing, which came up in the previous item as well, on wider dialogue about environmental care and protection. And I do wonder, I mean, we've had some really good work start with Raukawa Iwi and Waikato Tainui recently. It's very early stages, some of it, but reading this did make me reflect how much are we still asking people to fit into our box. But I think that's going well at the moment, so I'm not going to mess with it. But that reframing that I've mentioned, and that's mentioned in here about the wider ecosystem health, I think will land well with many different people. Yeah. Kara. Are we happy to move on? Yep. Nice and efficient.
I was just going to make a comment.
Stu. Yeah, Ben will move.
To me, one of our biggest challenges is that the the message won't always, the honest message won't always be well received, but because it has a negative impact. And we need to be careful not to make too much of some of the micro stuff we're doing around our own corporate emissions and things like that, because they're quite small in the context of some of the really big issues we're doing, and Sept is a really good example of that. Dare I mention it?
Yeah.
But you know, we have to, and part of me feels like, well, certainly for me, we've maybe been a little bit comfortable in the sense that it's not our role to ensure emitters are held accountable for their emissions. That's a central government role, but when you look at Sept, it kind of does fall right back into our lap again, and that there are going to be some tough decisions that are going to have to be taken into account going forward that really do impact us and require us to take the community with us. So that to me is our biggest challenge.
Thanks for that, Stuart. It actually just triggered a quick thought, which was as we're going through these papers, as I was reading them, I was thinking we are doing a whole lot, and as part of the performance measures, I suppose, conversation as well, I'm trying to think about where is the biggest outcome to be found, and where are we perhaps spending hours and hours battling with Infor or something, where the emissions impact isn't going to be that wide. It's nice for us as an organisation to get to that point, but maybe, and that's something obviously for Karen and others to just keep top of mind, and I know you do. It's just trying to think of it with the governance lens of what do we need to hear in order to keep asking that question as well. Ben?
Oh, just picking up on that, obviously in our own emissions, we're not dealing with peat. That's been excluded from this current view, which the graph went like this to, yep. And also, yeah, that was the main point. There was something else there.
That's all right. We get to come back to that because it's on the later piece of the agenda, Stu.
So I guess if I could, the point I was trying to make, Ben, was that I think we are, because decisions that this council ultimately has to make in terms of how a lot of that, it's not all peat, I appreciate that, but a lot of that land is managed. We have a significant part to play in that in terms of infrastructure providers. So it does impact us. That's the point I'm trying to make.
Was that the potential to get carbon credits from our plantings actually seems to make a significant difference to our ability to meet targets? The later paper. Yeah, even so.
My point, that's really easy, that stuff. It's really easy. Yeah.
Cool, thanks, both. Mike?
Yeah, just to follow on from Stu's comments, I think everyone individually, especially over the last 5 years, I'm talking about the ratepayers, which are, whether it's TAs or WRC, they're the same people. They're all very conscious on doing their part in climate change. And it's the same in all the committees. And, you know, in this report here, pretty much, you know, re-establishes that every committee is conscious about having that climate change embedded. You know, we've just got that report next week about the ZEBs, you know, the zero emissions by 25 for the buses and stuff like that. So I think there is, you know, when you look at those 4 reports, and, you know, Karen told me one was because it was unitary, one was regional, one was council. We fit, I think we fit pretty high in the comments from the Auditor General on what we're doing in this space. So, yeah, I think, and, you know, you going out to the TAs just kind of added that little bit extra flavour that they already put into their plans, long-term plans for their ratepayers. But I think people are conscious. I mean, that's why we live in New Zealand, is that we want, you know, to keep how we grew up as kids, you know, everything, you know, clean and fresh and, you know, in the right way. And our population is growing. You know, when I was a kid, it was 3 million. Now we're at 5 million. So.
Yeah, and it'd be really interesting to see what people are quite happy, like taking community with us, what people are happy to have us do and pay for. I imagine some of those nature positive projects might be really popular with the community, especially if we're doing some that include like a a recreational aspect that adds to their amenity
Sorry,
values.
Madam Chair, but
Yeah.
just the other thing too, I just want to know that the
Yeah.
big scary thing is the cost. You
Yeah,
know, that's
exactly.
what scares
So what are people
the
willing-
ratepayer on, you know, balancing what we need to do and then the cost. How far do we go, you know, with it?
I want to see outcomes, eh? Yeah, go for it, Karen.
Councillor Downard, the one thing to consider is the cost of inaction, of not acting. And there was a report that we brought to this committee some years ago, and I think it was one of the big four consulting firms. The cost of not acting, $4.4 billion. So we have to have perhaps more sophisticated conversations about the trade-offs of the cost of responding to climate change and the cost of not.
And that'll be the challenge to you guys when you write reports, is how to keep integrating
yeah,
that as
we've
well,
gotta get
because it's
better at
hard to
it.
put a number on it some of the time, but it
Well,
is.
I mean, I'm being
substantial.
blunt, but people speak with forked tongues. They're all happy to do it until it bites them and they don't want to do it.
Robbie, yes.
I've been talking about with Bruce as well, but it's actually, we got to find a sustainable model, that it's not actually about just ratepayers funding this all the time. That's the issue. We've got to find another mechanism of a super fund or whatever that we can receive money to do this, because we can't just rely on the poor old ratepayer every single time taking all the load. And
And
that's
the now
yeah,
ratepayer.
yeah. And it's finding a funding mechanism, and we're going to have to pick winners and losers. I'm sorry, it's going to be a part of it, but
The
the
political
ones that we are winners, we're going to have a good funding model that this can continue for the next 50 years, not like they're coming back every 3 years and they don't know if they're going to get funding or not. So like, that's the real issue, and each of our little zones in our region are going to have to choose what they want and what's best for them, because the funding is just going to become so huge we can't afford it.
Thank you for bringing the climate finance and biodiversity finance into it. I've just been following the UN COP, which is wrapping up in the next day or so, and that's the topic there, right? So I totally agree with you on
Just
that
a
point.
prime
Yeah.
example, Madam Chair, just sorry to carry on, is Thames Coromandel. I mean, their long-term plan is 700 million, and they've had to pull it back, you know, to year 4, 25 million, because they don't know whether they're getting any government funding. You know, and it's a huge cost, you know, when you look at our region and, you know, these coastals where there's flooding, not only from rivers, but also, you know, high tides, consigned or weather events. So it is something that, you know, central government, because we can't, the ratepayers, even though we're taxpayers too, you know, the end of the dollar, but yeah, they just can't do it, you know, and they're scared, the Thames Coromandel, you know, and that's why they're looking for a lead from WRC. But then again, when you look at the model, if they do go to the YHEL model, it's still 15%, you know, for general rate. And then the targeted rate, you look at the area they're looking for the targeted rate, it's a lot of retirees,
I hear
you know, so, you know, it's just, yeah.
Ben, you had one more?
Oh, just to pick up we had our meeting yesterday for the Kaiawa, and they're looking at $120 million for dealing with climate change issues and raising houses. And
Just noting that all of those numbers are still very open to
they'll
change.
probably go up rather than come down. But I mean, it's very and targeted rate for a small community of 5,000 people. It's not possible, really. So
that's why we put the disclaimers at the start of everything. We don't know what those numbers are going to be yet. But Karen, I really like the way that this meeting is quite conversational. And my last point was just going to be, in the developing of the KPIs and performance measures that you and the staff are going to do, if you think it's worthwhile to pull the committee members or councillors in to workshop it a bit rather than in a formal meeting, and you get more out of that, then please do that. Otherwise, just bring it to the next meeting.
Yeah, thank you very much for that.
All right. Then Ben's already moved this. Stu, happy to second? All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Cool. Get back to time. Right, the next item we've got is by Joy Moyer on the Climate Action Roadmap update. Thank you. It's by default become a 6-monthly update anyway, because we didn't have the last meeting. Yes. Yeah, just make it. There you go. Go for it, Joy.
Right.
It's a lot of work in here, so.
You'd think by now I would know how to do this, wouldn't you? Go for it. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here, and it's great to be sharing quite a few reports with you this morning. And we are going to kick off with the Climate Action Roadmap. That is April to September. Are you able to put it on slideshow? Yeah. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
So
We'll keep trying to make it go full screen. It's just full screen on our front screen, but not on the big one. But keep going and we'll figure it out. Yeah.
So we have now been reviewing and overviewing the reporting of the roadmap since it was released back in October, re-released September last year. So we're on our third iteration, or not iteration, our third round of reporting. And as Jen said, we are moving from 3 months to 6 months. The roadmap, as you will see, is based around 9 evidence-based pathways that help the council think about and act on how to reduce its emissions and also how to adapt to climate change. It highlights areas that represent the biggest challenges that the council has and also the opportunities that we have within our sphere of influence. And it details all the actions that we are taking, and it's about creating as much opportunity to talk about these things, act on these things, and work together collaboratively as an organisation with the TAs and the wider community. What I'd like to just spend a few minutes on is on the table that has the overarching results, which hopefully will show with us soon. So of the 109 commitments, we have 74 that are in progress. We have 11 that are in planning. We have 12 that haven't started yet, and I'll go through a couple of examples on all of these. We have 7 that are awaiting central government. We have 5 that are completed, and that totals 109. I'm not going to take you through all 109 because we'll be here for a very long time, but it's what's good to see if you look at the table in front of you. If we move from right to left, you will see that all of the categories that we have shaped for the reporting is moving in the way that we would want it to. So the commitments that are in progress is increasing. Those that are in planning are kind of decreasing, but will increase as things that become not started become into planning. So there is kind of a nice little cycle with these. We have got more that we're waiting central government, but again, we've had a change in government. So a lot of the policies and some of the things we need to act on needs time as they come about. And we've got a whole 5 that are completed. It's important to note that we will never get to a point of 109 being completed because several of these are aspirational, directional. So they are giving us a direction of travel, and they're also business as usual. So there will always be actions that happen within them. In the report that got shared, there's a table of several of those that are in progress and in progress. If you want, we can talk to a couple of them or not. So, for example, 3.3, increase our understanding of the extent and values of Indigenous biodiversity in the region. We now have a regional biodiversity inventory that's progressing well and is over 70% validated. So everything is as an example of what's progressing. An example of something that's in planning is, we mentioned it earlier very briefly about infrastructure. So we want to reduce the emissions associated with construction and operation of flood management and land drainage. So we're starting to have conversations about what does that look like and how might we bring that into our BAU. So there's lots of examples I can go through on each of them, but I'm happy to leave it there unless you want more detail.
Thank you. Go for Councillor Nebo.
Just one question. So given the example you've just talked about, do you ensure that the effort and cost incurred to, for example, reducing emissions on a particular part of an infrastructure project is considered along line, what's the best bang for a buck sort of thing? Like we're not spending $20 to get effectively a return of $10 in terms of emissions reduction? Yeah, because there are some areas that are going to be really easy and others that it's probably better to leave and work on something else.
So this is all about pragmatism and
Yeah,
doing the
yeah.
right thing for the money that we have and what we can achieve to
Yeah,
make
yeah.
sure we achieve all our operational gains, and just thinking about where the energy efficiency and other opportunities are.
Yeah.
What I would say is that it's not ingrained yet. As I said, it's in planning. So we're beginning to have the conversations to look at what does that really mean for us,
Yeah.
and how might we, look at that across all the
Yeah,
different projects that
yeah,
we've got. So that's definitely at the beginning part of the planning
Yeah,
stage.
yeah. And I guess the example on the easiest one is bloody airlines saying, oh, we're going to change from plastic cups to paper cups and do a ginormous marketing campaign. Get real, guys.
Yeah.
You can't see through that. Yeah, thank you.
Councillor Downer.
Same as plastic bags with supermarkets. I mean, really, we should be looking at plastic bottles. Anyway, Joy, just my thoughts just straight away with the workshop we got next week is your last item in the progress was the mission buses.
Yep.
And how we've had, or even emissions to meet the target, how we've had probably $23 million worth of government funding that hasn't gone into our walking, cycling and stuff like that. But also, the zero emissions on buses, how are we going to meet our targets if suddenly, that's been wiped out of the GPS and, and then we've got these buses and again, it comes back to the cost, who's going to pay and, fund that.
I'm a firm believer that you always do the very best decision you can at the time with
Yeah.
the information and the finance and the circumstances that you have. That it's about thinking about trying to be as long-term as possible with any thoughts and any decision making, but to be truly sustainable and to be truly kind of operating in a positive manner, it's always taking positive steps. And it would be great to do everything tomorrow, and it would be great to do everything the day after. But if at this moment in time there is a rational decision that has to be made, it has to be made. But trying to get everybody to think long term would be the way I would think about it.
So I'll just use this for an example. So say if, the government at the time, which they did in 21, said, right, we want a mandate to bring the emissions down by the 1st of July 25. And then this next government comes in, does that change that mandate? Do we stick to that mandate at our cost or?
I'm not sure I'm the
I'm
right
just,
person to, but what I would
But we
say,
can add a little bit. Like my understanding is, because we saw it through the latest emission reduction plan consultation, that this current coalition government hasn't changed that. They kind of, I don't know if they've even commented on it a whole lot, but they've just let it be. Whereas they changed a hell of a lot of
yeah,
other things.
yeah, but that's what I'm getting at.
And-
Suddenly when there's some great amount of money being taken out of one that brings our emissions down, I'm talking about walking and cycling. How much more does that put on something else,
cool. The
for us
trade-off
to
part.
achieve the trade-off?
Sure. Sorry. Light.
I think, Councillor Downard, we will always work for the best outcome for the region. And while we have to respond to government direction, we still have choices as a region, and we will tackle those decisions when they come. But at this stage, there's no indication that direction is shifting and that we still will be working toward those EV buses being brought on to our services.
If it helps, one thing I heard about a year ago was that the bus companies we were dealing with in our contracts were saying, this is hearsay, but from memory, that it's actually impossible to get a new diesel bus into the country at the moment. So it's almost kind of, it might be one of the reasons why it wasn't touched. Ben?
A couple of things. So picking up on Councillor Downer's point there, possibly when you've got your table, we could have something there that indicated issues that may challenge the targets. For example, a cut of $230 million in transport funding or something like that, so that you could actually have, it means that the whole project would be more relevant to today, but also moving forward. Comments on that?
I had I think what's a similar comment on changing the table slightly, but do you
No,
want
I'm
to
just saying
expand on that a little bit?
below
to
the
make-
table, the
yeah.
idea that you almost have changes since previous report or something like that. So the indications are that
So rather than the update in the
no,
table,
yeah, but
having something underneath as to what the key changes are?
the key changes in government policy that may impact on the ability, rather than the problem with this
Oh,
table
I see, yeah.
is that the other issue with the table is you can't tell which of the items that are completed and which ones are in progress.
So, yeah, so that's the interesting thing with 109 commitments of
Mhm.
how much to share and how much to kind of give. Yeah. So
Yeah.
there's a definite fine balance with that. If you notice on the in the report, there is a table for in progress, a table for challenges, and a table that's completed. So they will always get updated.
Right.
And so the table that's in progress, they will always be updates from that last period. So it's not like a cumulative progress on those. So there will be different ones each time where there has been some significant progress. So I'm very keen to kind of give you what has happened very, very specifically within the last 6 months. So it should always be a new report. But if you're thinking about a trend against the commitments, is that what you're thinking more about trying to understand?
Well, it's the differences in government funding policy that may impact on your ability to meet targets is what the point you were making, wasn't it?
But you make a great point too, Joy. If you can make that happen on top of everything else.
There's a lot of work there.
Yeah, but this is the right conversation from what
Mm.
Karen foreshadowed before if we want to have about what governors want to see.
And this is really, really helpful for us. So please
Keep going.
Keep it coming.
Yeah.
I think we probably could pick up on your point, Councillor Dunbar-Smith, and just have some really significant explanatory notes
Yep.
at the front with
Yeah,
that table.
Yeah.
You know, just those ones
That'd be
that
great.
really are key. Yeah.
Second point is when it comes to water and coastal and marine aquaculture, I attended the aquaculture conference.
Yes.
And there is a significant risk to the whole industry from lack of spat. The spat that's been collected is not taking in the Karakiā Gulf, which is relating to climate change issues. And the industry was actually talking about the risks of potential decline, significant decline in the industry due to that fact. So could I suggest that you actually follow up with the August meeting and possibly add a report back at the next meeting on where they're at in relation
The
to that? 'Cause
agriculture judge. I know that there's been some more work since the strategy was finalised. So yeah, I can
yes, I
provide an
talked
update.
in here about they're having a meeting in the 22nd of August 2024 for the aquaculture group. Maybe a report back from them on the implications of climate change in the Gulf, because that's a $30 million industry that supports the Coromandel, so it's significant.
Be an interesting topic
can
because
do
I
that.
was going to raise something in the local climate risk assessment paper about how it says we have little data on marine heat waves, and I imagine that's part of the issue. And
They
we'll
don't,
have to explore further what else.
they don't
might
really
happen.
know why it's happening. Other areas are having, but they're actually having to harvest the spat from Karakiā and take it to the South Island to grow it, to bring it back here. It's going from the little seeds to the
Yeah,
10, 20 millimeters. So,
thank you.
but if you don't get the seedlings coming through, you don't have an industry quite rapidly. So the other point was in relation to 4.19, which was working with iwi and hapu. That was specifically relating to central government, but I wondered there whether we should actually include in there the CDM sort of stuff that's going on. The idea there's a new person in CDM that's iwi related, and they were talking about working much more extensively with Marae and that sort of area. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, and a personal goal of mine is to get a bit closer in the CDM space to the climate impact interface. So maybe we could have a paper on something in the future as well on that. We'll see. I'll have a chat with Karen.
Okay, we can take that way.
Recently, we had a big
Workshop,
discussion with the CDM people, and they're probably quite happy to talk significantly about climate and issues. And
Yeah, I'd like
resilience.
to know how far they are in the proactive side of life that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Because they told us a lot about the reactive side that they
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But even in terms of Marae being places where people can gather, et cetera, or where the gathering places are and how they make sure they're secure and
Great, thanks. Robbie?
Thank you. I'd just like to point out that our funding model around biodiversity and native plantings and stuff, and our communities wanting more, I'd like to see you guys push that. I'd like to see that us as council, since we're investing in that spot, that we're getting some of the carbon credits and the biodiversity credits for that, so then we can reinvest in more areas in the region. Because we've given that investment freely to, so like some of them we're funding 40%, I think, and with fencing and everything else. Yet, so that investment is totally on that landowner, and he or she or they are collecting all the carbon credits and that, but they're not shared back with us that we can then invest back in another catchment or thing. And I think that's something that I'd like to see this committee push forward to Stratton Pole and other areas to make that a change, if that's possible. I don't know if it's possible or not, but it's something that I'd like to see, because we need so much more money in that area to invest in the whole of the region. And when we're investing, then others don't get it either. So that's more of what I just said earlier about funding for the future. That will give us that sort of capability. So thank you for letting me speak there.
I appreciate that, Robbie.
And that adds to the nature positive conversation that we will have later, definitely, about understanding where we are in what we're achieving and how we can use that as an opportunity for conversation and kind of increasing that awareness and opportunities. But yeah, that's a long game with that.
And certainly, Councillor Cookson, when we were first developing the Nature Positive program, we looked very closely at how might we have that carbon sharing agreement with landowners. So it's still there. We have looked at the mechanics of it. So it is something that would be work in progress after we've finished the first few phases that we have agreed with Council to date.
Okay, my point on the table was, because I'm part of Risk and Assurance Committee and part of the project reference group, and so when we get updates on key projects, what's quite helpful is having a bit of a guide on if there are challenges, what's impacted. Is it time, quality, cost? Okay, part of that triangle, or perhaps even other projects, because sometimes an impact is that because of time impacted, it's actually going to delay a different project. That would be really interesting to have in that update, so that, because at the moment it kind of reads like, this is what's happened, leave it with us. And I'd love to be able to contribute more, that if there is extra funding required or something else, that we can have that, we can be primed sitting down here already to talk to that. I'm mindful, I think I saw the local climate risk assessment once came through CERC talking about, whether to get extra funding, but we didn't have that chat here, for example. I think too long ago now, but it'd be great to know if it is time, quality or cost or other projects that are impacted, and how we can help you guys to move something ahead if we need to talk to our councillor colleagues to shift one of those. That's all I had. So people ahead. Yep, Ben's happy to move. Stu, happy to second. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Great, then we'll thank you all. Then we are up to the local climate risk assessment paper by Lisa Armstrong and Derek Finn, our senior spatial analyst. Let's see. And we've seen Lisa before. Hello. Can you put the slides back up? And we'll just get the slides up for you. Oh, great. Great. Here you've got some others joining perhaps, but for now, Lisa and Derek, feel free to start taking us through it. Should come up shortly. Thanks for bearing with us online. Well, wait another moment while we get the PowerPoint loaded. For some reason, it's not coming up properly.
Through you, Madam Chair, if you'd like, I can share the slides from my
Welcome to.
computer, I think. Oh, no,
There we go, they're back.
Okay, we are. Maybe. It's looking promising. All right. Go for it.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, kia ora tātou, Madam Chair and councillors. Our report today is providing an update on the work we've completed since May on the Regional Climate Change Risk Assessment Project and sets out our findings and also seeks this committee's support for the proposed next steps and change in approach. Climate change risk and adaptation is sort of a rapidly changing space and almost an emerging area of practice within New Zealand and across the world. And so, you know, as we've moved through this more detailed phase of work, we've identified that there may now be actually some better options to actually meet the project objectives, and that we may actually need to have a change in approach. Go back a few. Yep, you've skipped ahead. Thanks. Cool. Anyway, so to highlight some of the key aspects in the report, Derek and I prepared a few slides that we'll take you through. And the first couple of slides will just be a refresher and a quick overview of climate change risk assessment in a general sense before we move into the more specific details of the project. So next slide, please. Okay. So just a reminder, there's a range of ways to assess climate change risk, and it's important to remember that our regional climate change risk assessment work is not happening in isolation. So, you know, ranging from national climate change risk assessments, regional, district, sectors, communities, and organisational. So all of these types of assessments overlap in some way and support and inform each other. And as you move more towards the centre of that circle on the slides, you know, you can become more focused and place-based in the understanding of the climate risk. So on the right-hand side, you can see who typically would lead climate change risk assessments. So at a regional scale, led by this council, district focus, the TAs, sectors, led by sectors, and actually just picking up on Councillor Dunbar Smith's comment about aquaculture risks. An example of where this work done at a national or sector-led level is through the Aotearoa Circle, which is a voluntary initiative that brings together public and private sector leaders, and they've actually created a New Zealand climate change adaptation strategy for the seafood sector. And so, for example, the CE of the Aquaculture New Zealand is on that leadership committee. So that's a really robust piece of work that actually looks at the risks in detail to that sector and has a strategy to address. And I'm more than happy to share that link if you're interested.
Just on that, is that being included in your work for the Karakiā Gulf?
No, because we're looking at a regional scale. So
That's what I mean.
Some of those issues have been raised in our phase one work, but our focus, I mean, we can't dive into the detail of every single one of the risks that are raised. We can flag them as risks, but we can't really do anything further
At the moment.
on that.
But the goal is that we will one day.
Yeah.
And
Because that's where it's useful.
Yeah, and that's the intent of the regional scale risk assessment, is to actually flag areas for further investigation.
Well, the conclusion of phase one fully wrapped up.
And it's, I guess, in terms of risk assessment generally, and particularly when you're looking at that wider regional scale and also national, we are not always the owners or the right people to be treating some of these risks. Yes, we can advocate, but there's any number of risks that rightly sit with the health sector or the aquaculture sector, and we can play a role in a leadership role in facilitating that, but actually owning those risks is not always council's role.
But just so I can clarify, is this the Waikato Regional Council's risk assessment, or are we gathering information from various other areas to look at what the risks are to our region?
This is a regional scale risk assessment.
Yeah.
The organisational risk assessment is a separate piece of work looking just at our assets and our services.
Yeah.
So this is the regional scale, which Lisa will be covering in more detail. Yeah.
So, I mean, it will be looking, for example, at Kaiawa and what the risks are there, because we know what they are. Will they be included in this document or in this?
The high level.
High-level.
The high level
At a
ones
very high level.
would have.
Yeah.
But every time there's an adaptation project being led by a district, they would need to do detail level, or we would need to support them with that detail should we have it.
Or could that not be added as an appendix to the document, because we've already got Kaiawa completed effectively? We know the costs and the risks. And
I imagine it would be referenced in what's published at the end of phase one, like as an example.
Absolutely, we'll be referring and bringing together, references to a range of different work. Because if you look at that diagram, at that community scale, that is where a lot of that more detailed understanding of risk is taking place. So, in those TA-led projects where, as Councillor Cookson just mentioned, for the TCDC work, we've had really good feedback about how our staff have been supporting that more detailed understanding of risk assessment and risk models. And so that is the right level where you would dive into that detail. So at our regional scale assessment, we'll be flagging those risks and identifying them, but at those more detailed, granular levels, that is the right place to be investigating them further.
It's kind of like, I imagine that we saw some flood modelling of a whole nother level of detail recently.
Yeah.
That wasn't available for, say, the phase one work that has been undertaken, and wasn't part of that. It was just more Kaiawa and flooding is the high level that the phase one kind of is at, from my understanding.
But I'm just wondering whether, I mean, if I was looking externally and wanting to know what are the risks in the Waikato region, I would come to this document.
Or the one that would be published soon.
Yes, you will. Yeah.
The end of the
upcoming
phase one
report, if you wanted to know the priority risks and the key risks for the Waikato. I will cover this in subsequent slides.
I would hope that all the other data we've got on Kaiawa or Port Waikato would be included as appendices, because we've got already lots of granular data there already. That doesn't have to mean anyone has to start and do it again. It's just you could go a central point where you can go to start to look at risks.
But is it fair to say we haven't quite got to the point of how we're going to enumerate all that data?
Yeah, and data from the various districts, since those things are happening in silos at the present, are not in the same format. So while we can reference that there's things, but I think Lisa will cover that shortly anyway.
Just on that was the point you raised in your chairman's report, that it is siloed. I would hope this is a way of not siloing it, or at least.
This is a great project to work with the districts on to get consistency in future. Yeah.
And this is absolutely, this project and the report that will be produced is absolutely the right place to be bringing together that high level understanding of risks. But as we'll cover later, we actually need to be really careful. We're in a cost and resource constrained environment. We don't want to be duplicating work that is actually being undertaken in more detail in other parts of the region.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I'll just leave Robbie. Did you have a comment for just now?
Yeah, I've been speaking to Rick quite a bit about this, and resourcing and modelling are the two issues that are huge costs that are struggling with climate change modelling and the resourcing of it. So I understand that we just ordered a new supercomputer so he can speed up that modelling. So that's a real benefit. So thank God that's started, because otherwise Rick would be put under some serious pressure that his capability of getting some of this data, and it's fine to do a prediction, but if the modelling isn't accurate, then you're just scared. You're putting insurance companies and other
You're opening up.
organisations. Pardon?
Opening up problems, eh?
Yeah, and it's a real issue. And Ben made that very aware when we were in the Karakiā meeting the other day, that predictions have to be accurate, that people can see it with their own eyes, that it is something that could happen, and not over too much or too little. So it's finding the middle ground in the safe sweet spot when we're doing this modelling is really important. Yeah, so it's we got to be, hopefully, as you said, the Kaiawa one has been done, but hopefully all the learnings out of that, we're going to have to be very aware and keep to the game plan and not.
And
I'm just trying to, because it's really important, because otherwise community, if we fail at this, community will blame us for it and we will get shot. I do not want this to turn into a Muggridges or anything like that, because you've got to have community buy-in that they believe the modelling is accurate.
That's our role of the
Yeah.
regional council, to provide the technical support to all of this stuff.
Next.
I'll let, and Lisa, yeah, and Lisa does point out we can't do detail everywhere. So hence the high level flagging is to then allow the detail to be done in the places where it makes sense. So we stick with pragmatic. And so Lisa, I'll let you carry on so that we can get to the end, and then we'll give you some more questions.
Okay, so this next slide is really just, I guess, demonstrating, the pathway or the journey that you can undertake in terms of understanding climate change risks. So at the left-hand side of the arrow, you've got your qualitative, expert, opinion informed. So it's really just drawing on the wisdom and the discussion and the expertise in the room to inform your risk assessment, moving through to the other end of the continuum, where you're actually making, highly data-informed quantitative decisions. So
We're putting numbers on things, not just saying it's probably going to rain more.
Yeah.
Got it.
And so the climate change risk assessment, using the Ministry for the Environment methodology, is typically at the qualitative end.
Right.
And as part of our thinking, we're trying to, use the data that's coming on board through the modelling and work through a whole heap of other pieces of work to actually move us towards that more quantitative space of, climate maturity in terms of risk assessment.
So that engineers who actually build things will be able to work with it, right? At the district council's process level, which we've kind of worked through. Yeah.
And I should note that at that more quantitative end of the spectrum, in terms of risk assessment maturity, the work on the adaptation projects that is happening across the region is more at that quantitative level.
Right.
So that's where we actually commission the more detailed modelling and data for floods and any other number of hazards, and actually then take it through a quantitative risk modelling process.
Yeah. They want to know how high to build the road.
Yeah, and
Not
it's
just
a
that they
much
should
more
build the road
detailed
up.
assessment.
Yeah, I hear you. We want it to be useful for people.
All right, next slide, please, Brock. So just moving into the detail of this specific project at the moment, just recapping the project objectives. So at a high level, understanding the priority risks to inform adaptation planning and targeted action, and to communicate key risks to stakeholders and partners. So at a very high level, that's what we want to achieve from this project. On the right-hand side, you can see, I guess, some of the streams of work. So our regional risk screening, where we gathered, I think, 251 or 231 direct risks and a number of other indirect risks. They had a really great response to that from across the region, from stakeholders and staff. And then phase 2, moving to understand those risks in more detail across the region. So we've carried out a heap of work around that. So planning, getting proposals from consultants to deliver some of that detailed work, piloting the detailed methodology for the rating, and also then looking at how we can more quantitatively bring into some data to help support that assessment. And so that is where Derek's been leading some work on the geospatial exposure assessment, which is to help inform our detailed understanding and options for presenting and presentation of exposure and detailed assessment results. And so that has been the focus of our work since May, as we updated at the last committee. And as part of that, we paused the work on the detailed risk assessment so we can reflect on completing the work that Derek's just is going to talk about shortly, and reflect on, okay, well, what is actually the best way of meeting these project objectives, particularly given the world has, the space of sort of climate change risk modelling has actually moved on a bit in the last couple of years. So we'll talk to that shortly. So over to you, Derek, unless there are any other questions at this point. Next slide, please, Brooke.
Let's launch into it.
Thank you, Lisa. Good morning, Madam Chair, councillors. Yes, so my name is Derek Finn. I'm Senior Spatial Analyst with the Spatial Information Section in WRC. And Lisa and the team tasked me to lead the exposure assessment because it's a geospatial, a GIS-based exercise, essentially. So there were 4 key tasks as part of that project. And the first one was to do an inventory and catalogue of priority elements and hazards data. And does everybody know what I mean when I say elements?
Like categories?
Elements are basically things,
Yep.
roads, land use, animals, taonga, everything that's out there. So
If you're building like SimCity, you'd have elements, right?
I love SimCity, but
Gotcha.
yeah, that's why I do what I do. But no, so essentially we're trying to find databases of elements, all the elements out there. So there's a lot of things potentially we're trying to map. So we did an extensive inventory of that and the hazards data that we had available and that we deemed would be fit for purpose for this particular project. And a key outcome of that is that we're able to identify gaps in the data or the knowledge that we have for this particular exercise. And I'll talk a bit more about the findings of that particular part in the next slide. We also looked at doing exposure analysis. This was actually where we started getting to the nitty-gritty and what we call clipping, basically our elements and hazards data against each other, and coming up with statistics and numbers in terms of how many things are potentially exposed to particular hazards. So we did a little bit of work on that, and I'll again we paused the work for now while we got some user acceptance testing and review on some preliminary results. And I'll talk to the findings from that in the next slide. The exposure analysis is tabular results, so you get tables with the results, for example, the lengths of railways potentially impacted or exposed and the percentage of total railways, for example. Mapping was the next part. So we did some trial maps where we looked at land use and what is potentially exposed to. We did a scenario was baseline river and surface flooding data, and particularly looking at economic land uses and how much land is potentially exposed, but also looking at productive land. And again, that was to test the process and get feedback on the outputs, which produced some maps. And then finally, another part of the project, the 4th task, was to investigate options for an online tool to share and access the results, and looking both in terms of what we could potentially do in-house versus some external options that may be available. Next slide, thanks. So findings. These are the key findings that we found from the work so far, and I guess.
Oh, sorry. I'm just, Mike, you had a question?
Oh, sorry, Derek, to interrupt you. Just if you go back to that slide, the next one, the first, the one before this. Yeah, just there. So investigate options for online tool. We had that workshop on that map that we had and how wrong that map was. I'm just concerned, and even reading this document on data.
Which workshop? I just want to get in the.
Going back, you know, how we had access from the dairy milk companies on the workshop on the map that's on, peat soils and all that, and you know, how was it relevant to now?
Was this the Fred Phillips workshop?
Yeah.
Basically, everything was a problem.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that was a scaling issue. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Carry on.
Sorry. Yeah. So I'm just aware, you know, reading this and the data and what kind of data goes in, and is you know, anything's as good as what data's been put in there and how that data is found. So yeah, I just thought I'd bring that up because, you know, I just thought, yeah, it's fine having these tools, but as long as we've got the right data in there that people can access it, they're not going to then suddenly it be a huge cost to them, like we've heard about, you know, farmers on that map.
I totally agree, and I think I saw Derek nodding.
Yes, that's why at the outset of the project we came up with a definition of what is fit for purpose for this project, and that includes the scale and what is appropriate use of the data and what is not appropriate. And I talked for that in the very first point here about fit for purpose data, and when we looked at that for hazards. So we found that there's actually fit for purpose in the context. We were talking about, sorry.
That's all right.
Yeah, it had to be authoritative data. We're looking for getting the data from the appropriate agencies. Preferably it was covered the entire region. It just wasn't little patches here and there. We wanted to be able to use it at least at 1 to 50,000. Had to be accurate, and this is for regional scale assessments. And we wanted the data to be consistently modeled and mapped across the entire region, not just for baseline scenarios, but also future climate scenarios. So we actually set some quite strict criteria about what data was actually fit for purpose. And when we apply those criteria to hazards data, we actually found quite a lot of significant gaps. You'll see on page 69 and 70 of the agenda, there is a table summarizing where we landed in terms of assessing the climate hazards and the status of that data. And there is a key on page 69. And so basically, there was only one data set in terms of hazards that was truly fit for purpose for a regional scale assessment, and that was our baseline river and surface flooding data set. But in saying that, especially with the release of NIWA's latest downscaled climate data sets, potentially then that opens the door to some more analysis we can now do. But the NIWA data had limitations in that it actually requires subject matter interpretation to say, well, this is the variable that NIWA's provided, but this is the actual scenario you want to use, and you have to convert that into a hazard. So there's a bit of science behind it. But there's obviously some significant gaps, particularly around coastal erosion, groundwater rise and salinity stress, increased fire weather exposure, increased hail frequency, landslides and erosion, and then marine heat waves and ocean chemistry. These are the areas where we found actually there's not a lot of good data that's fit for purpose across our entire region at this time. A lot of it's still in R&D at the moment. Some of it may be coming, but we talked to a lot of national agencies. We talked to our scientists. We tried to find what we could. So there are some significant gaps there.
If I could just mention the marine heat waves one made me sit up most in ocean chemistry changes, just because I read from around the world, there's a lot changing quite rapidly since that's absorbed most of the heat so far. So yeah, it's amazing how little we have in that space, and considering we're just, you know, agriculture strategies and things.
Yeah, often like there would be some data, but it was completely not fit for purpose. So for example, that marine heat waves and ocean chemistry, NIWA had done some work, but it was mainly far offshore that they'd done the modelling. And it was very, very coarse and rough. You couldn't really use it to come up with any significant conclusions.
Well, it's good that we've got a bit of an idea of what we want to have.
I mean, I think one of the next steps is actually to really prioritise what the gaps are that are important to fill, because, I mean, in terms of that table, if you probably talk to any number of councils across New Zealand, their table would look very, very similar, and that they're, you know, their national gaps, and, you know, there is work, you know, occurring to progress them. And so, I mean, I think the other.
I was just going to say, I heard the regional sector group is talking about this type of work and wanting to share, hopefully, some advocacy in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I guess the other thing to just, I mean, Derek's already said this, but just to emphasise that in terms of the scope of finding data for this project, we were looking for the data to be available consistently across the region. So when you look at that table and you see all the gaps that say, okay, there's only one cell that's highlighted green and the rest are, you know, not necessarily suitable. That doesn't mean that across the whole region there isn't, in parts of our region, you know, detailed data that is actually suitable for modelling. It's just not consistent across the region. And that's where the adaptation planning projects that we're working on actually are building up that wealth of good informed data, and also the modelling program that this council has invested in through the understanding and adapting to natural hazard risk. So there is a heap of work in stream to address some of these data gaps.
Awesome.
And I
I'll let
guess-
Ben,
Yeah, oh,
Yeah,
if
or
that's right.
the question is then, are we shooting ourselves in the foot by insisting on a region-wide data set? Whereas, for example, the aquaculture people monitor the temperature of the Gulf because they need to for the mussels, and so does NIWA. So we will have sub-region data. I mean, if you can identify where it's likely to be a marine heat wave, it's not on the west coast of the, it's like,
Yeah.
so I wonder why we're insisting that the data has to be across the whole region.
well, that's what, I mean, we've reached that in terms of with the next steps for the project. We've said we need to focus on priority data sets,
Yeah,
which
where it
are
matters.
important across the whole region. So, and this exercise was also just to find what was available to help inform our analysis if we could. And you're quite right. I mean, why would you model marine heat waves on a part of the
West Coast, that's
coast
got
that's
nothing.
not going to occur it? So it's about
Other than to satisfy a curious scientist, of course.
yeah,
But I hear you.
yeah.
Stu?
Well, just
We'll
briefly,
let you-
this will be a work in progress for a long, long time, won't it? In the sense that even if you have got what appears to be the appropriate data for a particular issue today, that could evolve in 5 years' time, depending on
Yeah.
as science evolves and our information
Change and
evolves
climate
things like
change.
that.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And look, the one that springs to mind is saltwater intrusion into the Puha Lower Waikato, where the Waikato River comes out there, and the impact that has on native plants and that aren't used to a salt environment, all that sort of stuff. Yeah, as an example, and I mean, trying to replicate that on every estuary in the country or even in the region is a massive exercise.
Yeah, definitely. No, and it comes back to the point of wanting to have the districts lead conversations with communities of what they think is important. So if they're saying that they need a certain bit of data, love us to be able to support in that space when they're ready, rather than having to insist that everybody's got the same. Yeah. But carry on, please.
And there's also a balance in terms of, you don't want to end up in this space in terms of paralysis by analysis, and
That's
that
right.
at some point we actually need to get comfortable with using the best the data that we have available to make the
Just start doing stuff.
best decision we can, and for an uncertain future. So
Thank you. I agree.
So the story anyway with elements data is better. Lots of data out there. We will look, and to be fair, the bulk of the work that we've been doing since May is in this element space because we found so much data. But of course, that presents a problem in itself, is that the data is in all sorts of formats and statuses and shapes, and we have to try and mold that into a consistent regional picture of that data. But we ended up identifying about 78 elements that we wanted to map, and we found data sets we thought were fit for purpose for about 61 of them. But we noted that about perhaps 29 of those 61 did have some kinds of limitations around their use that we have to think about. But certainly there was a lot of data that we came up with in that space. So that was, and that's all been inventoried, and we make that information available to the likes of our TLA partners and everyone else who's working in the space as well, so that they don't have to go down that road again. We then used that hazards and elements data to do the analysis. And that's limited so far, given that we really only had that one regional scale flood hazard data set with which to try doing some of this analysis. It's quite a laborious task. So maybe we would need to invest in some automation to make the processes happen faster if we had to. But soon if we start bringing in more of this data, especially more hazards data and more climate change scenarios, that is going to become an extensive task to do it all. Mm-hmm. And then we went to the mapping. So we actually mapped the results. And it's hard to visualize the results because potentially there is a lot of data to put that into context. If we had to map everything as a static PDF map for reports, just for the baseline river and surface flood hazard scenario, we'd need something like 120 to 180 maps. If we had all the data available to us for all the hazards and the scenarios and the elements, we'd possibly need to produce something like 8,000 to 12,000 maps.
Yeah, I think hopefully we've moved beyond static maps in 2024. So
which is why we're looking at an online tool
to
visualize this. But then the other thing, when we presented the maps to potential users, of course, the first thing they wanted to do was zoom in. They wanted to look at it in greater detail.
Yeah.
So the information that we're providing to them to say, here's a regional summary and a regional map was not detailed enough. They immediately want to look at it in greater detail. And that's where we have to be careful to say, well, the data is really not fit for purpose at that scale. That's where we'll get bitten by not using data that's sufficiently accurate.
Yeah.
So there's an issue there around scale of use and the fact that they want to explore the data in greater detail, and that a little map like that is not much help. Alternatively, if we do put it in an online tool, they can only zoom in so far before we have to say, sorry, got to turn that data off. Because if you're starting to use this course data at a property scale,
That
really
wouldn't be
gonna
responsible.
So
It's really the crux of why you're asking for the change in approach, through this paper.
it's one of them.
Yeah.
It is.
Thank you.
Except, what is it that you're asking for? Because it looked to be like you're looking for an online data tool,
Correct.
but it won't be able to be dropped down to the level of looking at Thames, for example, with flood hazards.
It depends on the data that we use. Most of the hazards data is not of sufficient scale, but some is.
It
Could
depends
certainly
on
be fun.
what that TA wants and whether that can be achieved as to whether you'd bother getting that tool, probably.
I'm just wondering
Yeah.
if we've been going about this the wrong way, looking at it across the region rather than the TAs pretty much know when they're at risk, like Thames, for example, or
I think there was a place for the region wide, and that was the phase 1 work, which now needs to really have a line drawn under it and complete. The
Yeah.
phase 2 is the change in approach. That didn't, it started one way and then learned a bunch of things. And then, but we'll get to what you're asking.
I should also perhaps mention that the TAs are also gathering their own hazards data, and we did an inventory of all of that as well. And so they have some other more detailed hazards data, and also elements data, but that's what we're saying, well, hey, here's what we've done. Don't duplicate the work. Some of this might be useful for you, use it if it's suitable. But there is certainly some hazards data that we wouldn't put in an online tool, because especially if it was a public one. Maybe for internal use, maybe, but certainly not public if it's not to that scale. So it does need to be managed carefully. And I talked there about the risk of duplication. We know other organisations are going down this track. We know that some TLAs are starting to do their own local community assessments and assessments for their own assets. We know that some lifelines utilities like NZTA, KiwiRail, Transpower are also doing risk assessments for their own assets. And to be fair, they know their assets better than we do. So they're relying on the hazards data perhaps from us if we've got any that's suitable, but they understand their assets better. So they're also doing that work.
My question on that was, are we feeling really confident that we know what everybody else is doing? Is our list, do you think, quite
No, not at
solid?
this stage, because there's so many organisations doing it.
Interesting?
It would be a massive job to know what everybody's doing in terms of their climate risk assessment. We do know, and we're getting a better picture of it over time.
And I do think, I mean, as part of, I think my final slide talks about our next steps, and there's a key part of that is the engagement. Once we've produced that that report, we're proposing early engagement to get sort of some immediate feedback from key stakeholders. And then in terms of when we actually produce the report, I actually think that's the space where we carry out really, strong, good engagement and actually get that, okay, well, these are the risks, who's doing what, and what's next, where are the gaps in our adaptation planning actions.
So a bit of an invitation with that publication.
Exactly, because I mean, this is just a risk assessment. It's not actually going, okay, well, what happens now? And it's that what happens now that is actually the really key conversation that needs to happen.
Oh, fair enough. No, good answer. Robbie, do you have a question, Robbie?
Yeah,
do you wanna come back to?
it's come up a couple of times in these adaptation plans. Has anyone ever seen the insurance companies'
Data?
data? And because I'd love to see it, because everyone's talking about it, and it's supposed to be from NASA or somewhere that they've got this information from. So I'd be asking who's got it, and is it relevant in any of the data they're using? Because I don't know. It's come up in a lot of meetings
It's a fair
that it's
question,
there.
Who wants to tackle that question?
I'll tackle that question.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Derek.
we have asked for it. We know that they have actuaries who focus and do the stuff for their business. It's their business to know what the risks are, but they will not share that data. They claim commercial sensitivity and they will never share it. And believe me, we've asked, and the organisation But the ironic thing is we know that sometimes they're using our data to help them with their risk. What they come up with, they will not share.
I saw a court case reported in the paper, and I think it was New Zealand based, where someone had challenged the assessment that the insurance company had done for their house, and I would have, and they basically had legal pathway to do that. So I would have thought at some point they're going to have to be transparent about it, but not already.
To date, we have not succeeded in getting any data from Lifeline's insurance agencies.
Oh, please keep
The
asking.
one you're talking about was actually TA data that hadn't been updated. So they were basing it on the TAs, and the house had been built on a mound rather than a flat, and so they could challenge it. But yeah.
All right, well, thank you for raising it, and we should keep asking. It's the right thing to do. Please carry on. We'll try and get through your
Sure.
presentation.
So managing data is also going to be a big challenge for us with this work. There is a lot of data, even with what we've got now, but even more so as more data comes online. And potentially think about when, as you say, data always changes, science, research and development happens, new data sets come out. We're going to have to figure out how we can integrate and update that data, and ideally using automation. But it's actually a lot of work to develop automation, so it's a big job. And you don't just manage data, you have to document it, and you have to do a whole lot of QA around it, so you have to be rigorous with it. And then finally, collaboration opportunities was another key finding, in that we've definitely started building those relationships with especially our TLAs who are doing similar work in this space. And we've started talking about, how can we get efficiencies of scale with some of these analysis, with some of the tools and what's out there. And certainly, how can we reduce duplication when we hear that they're starting to do their exposure risk assessments? Then we have to start thinking, well, how much value is actually what we're doing at regional scale going to be if you're actually already doing it at local scale? So we've been thinking about that. Next slide, please. So I talked about the online tool, and just to refer to what we've looked at. And firstly, there are some external options for both exposure and risk modeling in terms of how you would explore this data. And one example I've got here is something called the Resilience Explorer from an outfit in Christchurch called Urban Intelligence. Started as a R&D project as a partnership between Canterbury University and Christchurch City Council 5 years ago, and has now evolved into a commercial product with a big team supporting it. It's custom built, and so it's got quite a complicated back end, but it's got a very nice front end. It's externally developed and supported by this outfit. It's high performance and usability. It's got a good visual interface. It's relatively quick to launch once the data we supply them is ready. They've said they could potentially stand up the solution in 4 to 6 weeks once they had that data. It includes both exposure and risk. Users can analyze ad hoc areas on the fly, so it doesn't necessarily generate statistics and dashboards and data for just predefined areas. You can just choose some randomly selected subcatchment and it will generate the data for you. And it also can consume live and regular updates from the source. We host the data, and often we would, as an example, host the data and provide it, and they consume it live. It's relatively low internal cost for us to set up and support. On the downside, it's a commercial product. There would be high capital expenditure to buy into something that's including the setup and annual licensing costs. So that's an example. We've also looked at other products, including Riskscape, which is a tool provided by NIWA and GNE Science. And also we're looking closely at something that Te Puni Kokiri has just released as a proof of concept tool, which is quite interesting. In terms of internal options, what we're looking at there is using our online GIS, which is called ArcGIS Online. It's an out-of-the-box tool, which means it's sort of simpler, but not as flash. It's internally developed, and we would support it. We're a bit uncertain about the performance and usability at this point in time because there's going to be so much data going into it. But the visual interface could potentially still be quite good. It would be slow to build and launch, though. Nothing like the timeframes for a product that's already ready to go and launch. And it would just model exposure and show exposure, not risk, because we don't bring the fragility curves and all the risk data that goes into it that the external option has. And it would require manual and static data analysis and updates, not live updating data. That's when invested in extensive automation. Plus side, though, downside, there would be plus side, no capital and ongoing cost or very low. but then a very high internal cost for us to build this internal in-house, potentially 500 to 1,000 hours of work for development and setup alone. So a big job for us to build something that wouldn't even get close to some of the external options that are already out there.
Oh, yeah, I think that.
So that's sort of where we've come to in terms of our online options. And we're now talking with our TLAs who are also very interested in the Resilience Explorer and other options about, who wants to partner up on these options. So that's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. Really appreciate that. And when I saw it in the report about building an internal tool, I couldn't write no way any bigger on the page, just from previous experiences.
Yeah.
And obviously with the whole collaboration talk, it makes sense. So my question is, I had a look at the Resilience Explorer website. It is very beautiful, and I think that would be really helpful with communities for it to look really good. How many other councils have already kind of gone in the direction of using that one? Are you aware? I've heard of a few just anecdotally. But
Estimated probably about a dozen, including some regional councils.
yeah, no, and obviously, yeah, we can get feedback from them on how they're finding it. And so,
We've been talking to
great.
them quite a lot. Yeah.
I appreciate that.
Have we been cut short? I hadn't finished my slides.
Oh, sorry. How many more did you have? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. It's all right. That was the next steps and things.
Yeah, well, I can just quickly
I think-
talk to those if you like. Is that
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
okay? So I see, in terms of presenting all this to you, we've really reached the conclusion that, and as I guess with any project, it's really good to continually check in and say, okay, is this the approach we're planning to take going to achieve the expected outcomes and benefits that we've identified at the start of the project? So in terms of carrying out the detailed risk assessment, we're a large region, 11 TAs, diverse geography and coastlines, a huge number of risks, 231 direct risks identified in our phase 1 work. So carrying it out as per the current plan is actually going to be a huge undertaking in terms of consultant costs, staff time and participation of the stakeholders, subject matter experts. So as we've kind of worked through this more detailed phase, we think that delivering a one-off qualitative risk assessment is not necessarily the best option in terms of meeting our project objectives. And I'd have to be completely frank, if you said, okay, here's an extra 500,000, my recommendation would still be the same as what is in this paper, which is to, actually, if you move to the next slide, which is really to wrap up our, complete that final risk report, building on the phase 1 data and pulling in the quantitative data that we do have available, sharing that, engaging, continuing our collaboration with other councils and TAs and other groups. So for example, we're working with the Waikato Lifelines user group to help embed climate change in their current Waikato Lifelines Resilience project. And just continue that collaboration and continue investigating the opportunities to collaborate with our TAs on an online risk tool, and looking at the options, because I mean, some of those councils are looking across the region. There's a range of councils that are at different stages and places. So some have budget, some don't, some are ready to go now, others aren't. So we need to probably work through with the TAs carefully what the options are. There might be some that can go fast and then others that go slow. There's opportunities to improve the data. So we need to work through those options as part of our next steps. And it's very much a live conversation at the moment, because I know, for example, Environment Canterbury and Te Ura Kahika are also kind of thinking about, these more detailed risk modelling tools.
So that,
Well, actually, I've kind of covered the next
that's
slide,
the arc,
really.
isn't it?
Yeah.
What you've just summarised.
So essentially, yeah, that's
With
the
that.
summary. But
Right.
we've,
Oh, sorry.
there's just a general trend really to be moving to more of those detailed, repeatable, quantitative risk and exposure analysis, which is what these online tools can provide. So I guess, you've got the choice of having a one-off qualitative report that costs a truckload of money and a lot of staff and stakeholder times. That's a one-off piece of work. Or there's the choice of actually thinking, okay, well, how do we move forward? So we have repeatable, along that climate maturity risk assessment sort of maturity pathway I talked about earlier, to actually, have repeatable quantitative options. So, so it'll be a journey. It's not going to happen overnight, and we need to work through, options and, business case and funding proposals. So anyway, that's it from me.
Thank you. Mike,
Thanks,
and then
Lisa.
Ben.
Yeah, just on those options, those three options that you kind of given in the option 1, 2 and 3, out of the bullet points, in each option, probably you had 3 that had the word continue.
Yeah.
And so I think we should continue on those out of all those 3 options, but then just hold back on extra funding or costs into it at stage, to see what else falls out of TAs and other entities that are doing it as well.
Yeah, that's where Lisa's pointed out we have to go through the business case process, which will go into the annual plan. So it's only at budget time that we talk budgets, really. Yeah. And Ben?
Oh, yeah, a couple of questions. So you mentioned that when you were doing the analysis, you looked at economic land use as part of the mapping criteria. Will those maps be part of this regional risk and hazard report? Is it going to have mapping in it, or is it just a word-based report?
This report that's coming out is looking more at the climate hazards as opposed to the exposure. So we have got that particular output as available as a map, and it could be provided as a summary of work that we've done, and here's the sample output that we tested, to argue that case if we need be. But the actual report that's being written about climate hazards isn't so much about the exposure.
Yeah, we may include some of the actual analysis, but as Derek indicated, there's some concerns about, actually putting maps in, because people want to then drill down to far more detailed information that that the data isn't suitable for. So we might include some of the statistics to say at a regional scale, we think, X number of kilometres of road are going to be exposed to flood hazard under the current day.
I'd be disappointed if there's no maps in this report, considering it's a mapping report. I mean, if they're PDFs and they can't be drilled down, that's fine. But I'm just saying that
Do that. Yeah.
I mean, it's not an online tool as such.
The report that's coming may actually have some maps, and I've got to talk with Whitney about this, but there's a whole lot of climate hazard data, especially that NIWA data, that potentially we can summarise and map that and include that. So in terms of actual climate hazards, there will be some maps showing those.
Because we have a map showing climate impacts that we put into the climate action roadmap.
Yeah.
Having a next level of that would be really cool.
Yeah.
But it's not yet next steps that we're endorsing, hopefully, too.
Yeah.
And also the earlier we talked about the balance between the climate and the concerns with economic. It'd be useful to see where the economic land use sits in that, because we often don't see that balanced picture. The question was, the report's due by the end of 2024. Will we see it back in climate committee, or will it come out to another committee?
Or just get published in general.
So the first
Good
draft
question.
is due by the end of 2024, and so we'll probably we'll be testing that with some key stakeholders, and then I think the next committee meeting is February, so we may well have an early draft, a further draft that we can share at that committee meeting.
I'd also be hopeful that in the appendix you've got a link to the shoreline management and the Kaiawa, the more detailed studies. So you don't have to actually include them, but there is this individual work going on that someone can go and reference, almost as a reference.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Cool. And the other question, raising what Miko was saying, is investment decision subject to business case funding approval. Is that an annual plan process or an LTP process?
Each year's process for budget, depending on where you're at.
But this coming annual plan? Oh,
No.
okay. That's fine.
I would welcome a conversation in this annual plan, but I think with the timing, it's pretty unlikely. But my understanding is that, I mean, to make it's great having an online tool or something straight away, but if the data in it isn't that useful yet, you may as well pay for the tool once you're happy with the data you're going to put in it.
Yeah.
And so the delay might be okay.
Yeah.
But I am like, sooner.
So it'll be interesting to see in February what the report is. It's interesting work. Yeah.
Yeah. So if it'll come to the February meeting as after having been tested with some other stakeholders, that'd be great.
Cool. Madam Chair, just while I've got you as a captive
Yes.
audience, I did actually just want to really acknowledge Derek's work on this project, because he has actually been an absolute powerhouse in terms of leading and progressing the work. And we don't normally let him out very often from behind his computer.
That's true.
So, but anyway, I did just want to take a moment to acknowledge his assistance with this work.
No, thank you. And I can tell from his answers, he really knows some of the stuff. So, and really talking to those points that have come up in other workshops about, integrity of data and scale and usability and disclaimers you have to put on everything. So feeling really confident there. Thank you. Appreciate you coming to us. Yeah, my last comments that I just want to add, and this will feed, it's more for Greg's ears because it's going to feed into that budgeting at some point. I worry that we might get held up if we try and ask 11 TAs for budget to go into detail. I would like to explore whether that level of detail is something that we are happy to hold here and hence just purchase once for the region, whether that's through collab or just find a way to make it work or stage it as they're ready and invoice them later or something. But just hate for the admin of this, just like it is in public transport and why we're doing a new rating model, for example, to hold up progress. So that was my last thoughts, and I'll leave that for later. I've really appreciated the engaged discussion on this because this is a project that's been going on for a while and it's kind of zigzagging around a little bit. And I'm definitely going to keep diving deep into it to try and stay abreast of it because it is the one that I'd like the districts to be really happy with as well. So I'm happy to move. I don't think there's any further. Oh, and I want to just note that the recommendation on the page has been slightly reworded because we thought it sounded a bit fluffy. But we sounded a bit vague. And to be honest, it's not that super specific yet, but the last slide that was up there about the next steps and option 3 is the one it mostly aligns with and everything we've just discussed. That's what it reads, that we recommend we support the next steps and to meet the project objectives in the most, in that pragmatic way that was described. So that's what's up there. You happy with that to second, Councillor Downard? Awesome. And all those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Awesome. Thank you both. All.
Thank you.
We might just have a very short stretch for our legs. So we'll be back maybe 25 past. We'll invite our external speakers in for the last item, since that's kind of when it was timed for, and then ask Joy to come and deliver the item before that, after that. All right, just adjourn for about 5 minutes. Thank you.